We're back for your ears only. I'm Eddie Robinson.
I'm David Alpern with this quote from the news, "A gift from God." That was Pope Francis on the internet as a means of better interpersonal communications, although he warned it, quote, can have the effect of isolating us from those closest to us. And it was later announced that the Pope would visit the U.S. next year. Also last week, the Chicago Archdiocese opened files showing years of sexual abuse by priests covered up by church leaders. Now this.
So we all know Wall Street's high-risk betting nearly destroyed the economy, but since then we've made real progress with dodd-frank's implementation. But despite this progress, the four largest banks are now 30% larger than they were just 5 years ago, and they have continued to engage in dangerous, high-risk practices.
The $13 billion agreement announced today holds Chase accountable for fraud in both its own residential mortgage-backed securities business and in dealings with two other financial institutions that it acquired, Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual.
Despite the rebuke by Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren late last year and the record $13 billion settlement with the giant Chase Bank announced by New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, followed by another $2 billion hit on Chase for facilitating the Ponzi scheme of Bernie Madoff, making a total of $20 billion in fines for the year, the spirit of too big to fail or jail persists. In fact, Chase chief Jamie Dimon last week was awarded a 74% pay raise for 2013 to $20 million.
Why Dimon and many other masters of the financial universe are in the money instead of in the clink is a question answered in the new book, In Bed with Wall Street, The Conspiracy Crippling Our Global Economy, from Palgrave MacMillan. The author is Larry Doyle, a former mortgage-backed securities trader, now investment advisor and blogger at senseonsense.com. That's SENSE on CENTS.com. And for your ears only, he joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
What was your reaction to the settlement fines instead of criminal trials for so many heads of financial giants at the heart of the bad mortgage-backed meltdown?
Well, very simply, the fines are ultimately nothing more than a cost of doing business and an indication that justice which is misdirected is ultimately justice denied.
And what does the pay raise for Dimon say about corporate concern over ethics, risk, responsibility, and profit?
I mean, I could be a little bit abrasive and say that it means that crime pays. We'll be a little bit more respectful. But ultimately, really, what it indicates is that Wall Street is an oligopoly. And with just a handful of firms, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America, and just a couple others, dominating the market. As Senator Warren attested, these institutions are that much bigger. They have enormous market share, and ultimately, they own Washington.
Beyond the big bankers and their minions, how much blame is there in your book for state and federal regulators?
Extensive blame, primarily on the federal level. I think at the state level, there are a few state attorneys general who have done a good job, but ultimately at the state level, they're effectively outmanned. At the federal level, there's extensive blame for the very simple reason that the revolving door is well greased. And that revolving door not only works through these federal regulators into and out of Washington to Wall Street, but also within this self-regulatory entity known as FINRA. Ultimately, America needs to understand that Wall Street is to a large extent self-regulated and ultimately answers to nobody but itself.
And what about Congress?
Bought and paid for.
Yeah, talk about how funds from Wall Street flow to Washington that look a lot like payoffs.
Well, I mean, and again, I don't put that out, strictly for hyperbole. You really have to follow the money. And my book gets into very specific things. The flow of funds, which from 1998 through 2008 averaged $500 million every election cycle. In the last two election cycles, those levels have tripled because there's been a lot more that's been on the line.
Talk about whistleblowers who've been ignored, intimidated, or even terminated.
A lot of people in our nation believe, how come people on Wall Street weren't speaking up? And why is it that there's this code of silence? I'll tell you why there's a code of silence, because people who have spoken up, and there have been numerous, and I specify the stories in my book, what happened? They were ignored. Even worse, they were intimidated, both physically and professionally, and they were fired. And these were not merely junior-level employees, within the banks and the regulators. There were some senior-level individuals as well.
How significant and relevant are the reforms required by the Dodd-Frank legislation?
Dodd-Frank is an architectural blueprint. And so they laid it out there. Only about 35% of the legislation has actually been written. I would define that as kind of the low-hanging fruit, the stuff on the margin. And who is really having enormous influence here? The Wall Street lobby. The Wall Street lobby is working this like never before. And who else is basically holding court? The Federal Reserve is ultimately the one that is, having the biggest impact on that legislation. And the Federal Reserve, they're part and parcel of Wall Street itself.
What are some of the steps you suggest would make the system more fair and more stable?
Well, first and foremost, we need significantly greater transparency. So in my book, I lay specific things, disclosures within offering statements in prospectuses so that people understand risks of offerings. Okay? The second thing we need is information. We need information. Where are we going to get information? We need whistleblower protection. Bad practices will get exposed, but whistleblowers need to be protected, so I propose an Office of Whistleblower Protection. Another thing, I simply do not believe that Wall Street can be effectively regulated under a self-regulatory model. To think that Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and these other institutions can fund a regulator that will in turn aggressively oversee and regulate their practices, to me, that's a non-starter. I would propose bringing in a Financial Regulatory Review Board. Private citizens who would sit between the regulators and Congress, because Congress, again, bought and paid for it, and they also, honestly, they don't really understand this stuff. They really don't.
Larry Doyle is a former mortgage-backed securities trader, now investment advisor and blogger at CentsOnCents.com. His new book is In Bed with Wall Street, from Palgrave MacMillan.
Quote from the news, the level of opportunity is alarming even though it's stable over time. That was University of California, Berkeley professor Emmanuel Says, co-author of a study showing that the odds of moving up or down the U.S. income ladder have not changed in recent years, but remain remarkably lower than in much of the industrialized world.
Next, Very Lost and Found, a modern-day ring cycle for your ears only.